When you hear a story about someone's success, you'll often be told the abridged story on how that person succeeded. You'll hear all about what steps were taken to ensure success, what precautions were taken, and how odds were miraculously defied. You'll be given a story of heroism and achievement. An often overlooked aspect of these stories, however, are their shortcomings. This is true especially in war. The winning side stories will dominate public perception, highlighting their victories and emphasizing the opposition's shortcomings. The winning side's losses and mistakes are lost to time as they write the history they want the world to see. The American Revolution is no exception, with Castine, Maine serving as a great example. From an outsider's perspective, it is just a small coastal town in eastern Maine. However, a simple look into its history will reveal it's also home to what is largely considered the biggest naval defeat in American history before World War II. With a failure of this magnitude taking place in such a small town, it certainly isn't talked about much today. So, how did this event happen? How did the American government respond? And in short, who was to be blamed for the Penobscot Expedition?
So the Penobscot Expedition is probably the most famous event of the American Revolution that occurs in Maine. And there's not really much attention paid to Maine until events of 1778 and 1779.
During the Revolutionary War, Castine was known by a different name, Majabigwadus. This is what the land was named by the Abenaki tribe of Native Americans. Eventually, in 1779, the land would capture the attention of the British for its deep water-protected harbor, as well as how isolated it was from American settlements.
The other opportunity here is with the port, they are going to be able to better protect their convoys sailing between New York, which was the headquarters of the British Army in North America, and the base at Halifax. So it's right in between, and there'd be a place where they could support small ships and small warships in order to protect that trade from American privateers and the Continental Navy.
So, one of the things they do is decide to send an offensive mission into Penobscot Bay to establish a fort from which they would have a stronghold over Penobscot Bay, the islands, and a fair bit of the coastal region of Maine as well.
The British would send approximately 700 men to Majabigwadus, being led by two notable figures: General Francis McLean, who was leading the expedition, and John Moore. The Americans were quick to catch on to this, and in response, they decided to send an expedition of their own in an attempt to retake what is known as modern-day Maine. This expedition was to be led by Commodore Dudley Saltonstall.
Dudley Saltonstall was a captain in the Continental Navy, so commanded the Continental frigate Warren, which was one of the largest American warships of its time.
The other prominent figures featured in this expedition consisted of Solomon Lovell, who was in charge of the land attack, Peleg Wadsworth, who was second in command to Lovell, and lastly, Paul Revere, a famous patriot who was in charge of artillery. Word of the Americans' plans, however, would not keep.
Word of this does reach back to McLean and his officers here in Castine. They did not have a whole lot of time to prepare. So our time frames here are measured in days rather than in months.
McLean and his men would begin constructing what would be known as Fort George. However, due to their time constraints, the fort only managed to become a couple mounds of dirt stacked only a few feet high. Meanwhile, the Americans had managed to scrape together roughly 1,000 soldiers, 19 warships, and 25 support ships to sail to Majapahit. The British were going to be outnumbered and outgunned.
This is an expedition that is put together with incredible speed by the standards of the 18th century government. The 18th century government was not designed to move quickly. It was not designed to put together military expeditions. So the fact that they were able to get it together at all is quite remarkable.
These are not all volunteers. Some people were pressed into service. There was a draft during the American Revolution. They pretty quickly ran out of volunteers. There's also a really great commentary by a Patriot officer about the lack of quality of the people under his command. And he says that the impressed recruits were, quote, boys, old men, and invalids. They were soldiers, whether they could carry a gun, walk a mile without crutches, or only compos mentis sufficient to keep themselves out of fire and water. So at least from this officer's point of view, the troops that he was commanding were not a very impressive group. Another problem with this rapidly raised expedition is that the Massachusetts government offered to fully insure merchants for the value of ships that they allowed to go on this voyage. And so this is really a great opportunity. If you were a merchant and had a kind of substandard quality ship, you could send it off, get some kind of payment for its service, and maybe if you were really lucky, it wouldn't come back and you could get sort of the full value paid back to you.
On one hand, it's remarkable. On the other hand, the very speed that makes it remarkable provides some serious weaknesses.
On July 19th, 1779, the Americans left for Majapahit, beginning what was a 6-day excursion along the New England coast. Tensions are high as both sides are heavily underprepared. While sailing along the New England coast, the Americans would come up with their plan of attack.
And the plan was that Saltonstall would lead the Navy into Castine Harbor. The Army, led by U.S. Marines, would scale up the heights on the Penobscot side of the peninsula, come up over the cliffs, and attack by land. McLean knows that he's outnumbered. How badly, he's not sure. At sea, he knows that he is significantly outnumbered. McLean decides that he is going to try to defend the beachhead. So as American soldiers and Marines come up over the Penobscot Bluffs, he is going to fight from the top of the bluffs to try to prevent a foothold.
From here, the British would retreat back to Fort George, where McLean was on the verge of surrendering.
Under the rules of war of the day, he had to make an honorable resistance, which meant that there had to be a fight. Enemy soldiers had to be at least within sight of the unfinished fort. Otherwise, he could not surrender with honor. So the British continued to retreat to the outlines of Fort George, and there they wait. According to legend, McLean is sitting by the flagpole with a pocket knife in his hand, ready to cut down the flag as soon as the American army arrives. They never show up.
The Massachusetts troops are sort of unsure of how to launch a coordinated naval and land attack. And while they go back and forth trying to figure out their plans, their sort of moment of opportunity passes pretty suddenly.
The British had called out for reinforcements, which would be answered by a man named George Collier, a Royal Navy officer stationed in New York.
So the timeline for the Americans is starting to speed up even more rapidly because we have Admiral Collier starting to move up the coast himself.
However, the Americans would not seize their opportunity, instead creating a standoff between them and the British soldiers stationed in the fort. This stalemate would last for 3 weeks.
So to reach our conclusion of the battle, his squadron arrives in Penobscot Bay the day that the Americans had finally decided on a plan of attack. So the American fleet was going to go into Castine Harbor, the army was going to attack the fort, and his squadron shows up at the mouth of the bay just as this was starting to take place.
British reinforcements arrive by sea and capture the Massachusetts troops unaware. And so they flee up Penobscot Bay, up Penobscot River. A couple of ships turn around and try to slip by the British unsuccessfully. All the rest continue up and sink themselves at various points along the river.
The Americans had lost. A conflict originally thought to be nothing more than a simple expedition to rout the British had left 474 Americans dead. Alternatively, the British only lost 13 men.
So this is a devastating defeat for Massachusetts that has invested quite a bit of money and labor into this expedition. And it really is the last active military contest of the Revolution in Maine, in some ways the first and last.
Massachusetts would take a massive hit financially due to this venture, as most of the ships the government borrowed had been insured to the people that lent them out. Between this and other factors, the state of Massachusetts was left with a bill of just over £1 million. To put this into perspective, adjusting for inflation would leave the Massachusetts government with a bill of around $297 million today. With a failure of this magnitude, people would need to place their blame somewhere, and this would lead to the widely debated issue of who was to blame for this disaster. One person to receive blame for the expedition was Paul Revere, who had been court-martialed for abandoning his 100 artillerymen.
So we have Peleg Wadsworth, the second in command, point a finger at Paul Revere. The specific charge that he is leveling is that Revere's actions tended towards cowardice.
Although Revere would eventually be freed of all charges, his reputation would sink to an all-time low. That is until Peleg Wadsworth's grandson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
His grandson was a poet, and he writes the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which does a lot for rehabilitating Revere's reputation as a revolutionary and as a patriot of the revolutionary movement. Part of what's happening in 1860 is that there is a need for northern heroes of the revolution. As we start to slide towards civil war, if we think of the great figures of the American Revolution, we have figures like a Washington or Jefferson who are Virginians. So states that in 1860 are potentially talking about leaving the Union. There's a need for a northern hero, and Revere fits the bill for this in many ways, because he's a good, solid New England figure. He does have that moment in time in 1775, right at the start of the Revolution. So there is perhaps some creative embellishment of that achievement by Longfellow in order to make Revere become a revolutionary hero.
Another person to receive blame was Commodore Dudley Saltonstall, whose indecisiveness during the almost 3-week standoff led to him being court-martialed and removed from the Navy. However, many people wondered if he was truly to blame.
One of the recent books about the Penobscot Expedition has made the case that the Massachusetts legislature ends up blaming the Commodore, the leader of the naval forces, and he is sort of the one officer who is not from Massachusetts. He is from Connecticut. And so George Bucher has written this recent book, and he makes a pretty persuasive case that Massachusetts was sort of looking for a non-Massachusetts scapegoat to blame on this. But if you have a sort of fuller understanding of how the British secured their defensive location and the limits of some of the fleet that Commodore Saltonstall was commanding, we end up having more sympathy for Saltonstall's position and sort of see him as a sacrificial lamb in the midst of the aftermath of this great defeat as Massachusetts tried to blame someone who wasn't from their own state.
Did the failure of the expedition fall onto its leaders, or the government that commissioned it? While it could be argued the expedition was poorly led by Saltonstall, the point can also be made that the entire expedition was doomed to fail from the beginning due to the poor planning by the Massachusetts government.
If this had been a more thoroughly trained expedition, if the officers knew one another better and had been able to coordinate more effectively, it seems pretty clear that Fort George was there for the taking.
When you hear a story about someone's success, you'll often be told the abridged story on how that person succeeded. The same is also true when hearing about someone's failures. You'll need to give reasons for your success, and you'll have to give justifications for your failures. Did the Massachusetts government choose to justify its shortcomings by blaming a foreigner? Or were the leaders of the expedition to blame for their poor management of what would have otherwise been an easy victory? As is with most things throughout history, it will all depend on the interpretations of those who teach it.